Hi, and welcome to the video for Module 3, where we'll be talking about various periods in the history of ancient Greece, specifically the Archaic, the Classical, and the Hellenistic periods. You'll notice I haven't included Archaic in the topic because we're only just talking about one monument from that period. Before you get started watching this video, make sure you've done the readings in the textbook and also the supplementary reading about the Parthenon that I've posted on Blackboard. Once you've completed those, now it's time to start the video and, of course, take the self-assessment afterwards. So the major issues that we're going to talk about today are listed here on the screen. First, we have humanism, which is a concept I'll describe in more detail in just a moment, but it's a very important vocabulary word. We'll also be talking about the political situation of Greece. It changes quite a bit over the centuries that we're talking about, but also remember it is the foundation of most Western democracies. In terms of art, we'll be talking about the strong interest that viewers and artists had in naturalism and trying to make sculptures, make paintings look as real as possible, as much like reality as they could. Part of that was including mathematics to perfect art and architecture. Everything is done with very careful proportions and ratios in order to make things as harmonious as possible. And again, the last thing on this list is these three period distinctions: Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic. And these follow some general time periods. So let's go ahead and get started. Like always, I like to start with a map. That way you can see what we're talking about. Here's our general map of most of Europe and the Middle East and Northern Africa. And here I've indicated the area we'll be talking about. Most of the monuments we'll discuss today can be found inside this box. Here's an even more specific map. We'll be looking at a number of monuments today that are in Athens or were from Athens. We'll also be looking at a major monument that came from the site of Pergamon here in Asia Minor, which is now present-day Turkey, but this was part of the Greek Empire at that point. We'll also be looking at a monument in the city of Epidaurus down here on this part of the Greek peninsula. Of course, these other centers also had art and architecture in them, but as with everything, we have a very limited amount of time, and so you'll see more objects from different sites in your textbook. So, Greek art and architecture is very important for the history of all Western art and architecture. In the Western tradition, we consider our ancestors the ancient Greeks. Our buildings are based on Greek tradition. The Greek understanding of the world is very different than the cultures which came before it, including that of the ancient Near East and the Egyptians, which you saw in Module 2. One of the centerpieces of this is the concept of humanism. Humans are the measure of all things. Humans are at the center. The measure is from a human point of view. This is very different than a deity-driven social organization. And that's not to say that religion wasn't important. It very much was. But there's this emphasis on the human being. Their deities even are anthropomorphic. That is, that they assumed the bodies of humans. The gods are centered around the site of Mount Olympus, which we see on the map right here. And we have the same gods in ancient Rome later, although you'll see that they have some different names. The Greeks are rather xenophobic, and that's a word we still use today, meaning a fear of outsiders. They considered all those who didn't speak Greek, they considered them not even really human. That was how much they emphasized their own culture. The art of the Greeks changed at a very rapid pace. There's this strong interest in stylistic change, which is very different to the sameness that we saw in Egypt. There's also a different social organization. There's not really a kingdom going on here. Instead, they form themselves into small cultural groups centered on cities, and we call this kind of culture a city-state culture. There's a lot of very important cities, but Athens rises to prominence, especially in the 5th century BCE, although Sparta and Corinth are also major cities of these city-states that existed in the Greek world. So I'd like to go ahead and start with our major monument for the Archaic period. What we're seeing here is a standing youth, also referred to as the New York Chorus, because you can find this in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It comes from Attica and stands right about 6 feet tall and is made of marble. There are several freestanding sculptures of this type that survive. Many of these are authentic, but some are actually thought to be forgeries, and this one actually is considered by a lot of people to be a forgery. It shows a certain debt to ancient Egypt. Hopefully that's something that crossed your mind as soon as you saw this. You have the similar stance as we saw with the Ka statue of Menkaure and his wife, with the hands closed into fists, the arms kept closer to the body, and that stride of the foot, the one where the left foot is slightly in front of the right. It's a completely frontal figure. Notice the nudity as well. The Greeks emphasized the nude figure, especially of males, the entire history. You only start seeing nude female sculptures later on. At first, it's not an acceptable way to represent a woman. These are always life-size or even larger, striding forward, and originally would have been painted. We see here the beginning of an interest in musculature and this organic body type, although it is quite stylized. What I mean by the word stylized is you've got some things indicating basic shapes, but it's done in a really geometric way. So for example, if we look at the kneecaps, just like we saw with Menkaure, just like the Egyptian example, if you look at the structure of the muscles in the chest, this very simple curvature here, this simple straight line indicating the center of the body, and the muscles of the hips here are also quite stylized. I mean, there's some naturalism to it, but especially we see this in the eyes. Do you see how they're just very basic shapes? Eyes don't actually look like that, but it's close, and it's giving you the sense, it's giving you the right idea. Here we can see it from the side. You can see how quite shallow these figures are. It's really meant to be seen from the front and not from the side. Now, we don't know exactly what they were supposed to represent. Some people think they're meant to represent athletes or other ideal types. Some suggest that perhaps they're part of funerary contexts, and may it be portraits of those whose burials they were accompanying. It's really not very clear. And here I wanted to show you the hair. This is another really great example of the word stylized. If you look at this, and you take it out of the context of a body, it's really hard to know that this is supposed to represent hair. What we have is a pattern of geometric shapes put together, and altogether it represents human hair, but it's not really naturalistic. You could never mistake this for somebody's hair. I also wanted to show you an example of a female type called kore. Koros and kore mean youths, female, masculine and feminine, and it's very similar in type to the male, although notice the major difference. She is clothed. Also, here you see one arm is kept up against the body, and we're missing the lower half of the other arm. You see that circle there to the right of her body? That would have slotted in the last piece of marble. Perhaps she would have been holding her arm out extended or holding something up. You can also see here traces of paint, because originally all of these Koros figures were painted, and that would help them be more naturalistic, even though they don't seem like real people right in front of us. So here, for example, you're seeing the back side, and you can see more of the paint that survives. You can see that very similar hairstyle as what we just saw with the New York Koros with the male. And these drawings on the side give you a sense of the patterns that art historians have uncovered from the traces of paint. And here is a reconstruction of what it might have looked like with all of its paint intact. So you can try to imagine what these would have looked like standing outside in open spaces. They would have almost seemed like a real person, despite the stylized nature of the carving. So now we're going to move forward about 100 years, and what I'm showing you is an example of an early canon of proportions. And now this is something we talked about with the Egyptians as well, but with the Greeks they standardized their own body types. So this is an example of the early classical canon of proportions. There was a desire with the Greeks to create perfection. They were always seeking to further and develop that idea. This is even related to temple architecture, but right now, of course, I'm talking about it with the human form in sculpture. They have certain ideas of creativity, change, and the role of the artist. We're working in much smaller units of time here, centuries and decades, rather than jumping 1,000 years like we did from the pyramids at Giza to Akhenaten, for example. The classical period is framed by two major events. The first is in 480 BCE, and that's the defeat of the Persians by the Athenians, and that goes up to 323 BCE, which is the death of Alexander the Great. We have three major concepts with the Greeks: humanism, rationalism, and idealism. The ideal that they seek is based on the human form, and art is based on a very close observation of nature. Sculpture emphasizes the ideal male nude, because in ancient Greece, the idea of beautiful, if something was beautiful, it was associated with good. Ugly is bad, beautiful is good. And there's a mathematical definition to show what beautiful and good are. So truth can be attained through this rationality. So sculpture was a way to manifest truth. It's a very different idea, I think, than what we have today. Something that's very important before I move on is that almost all of the sculpture that you'll see in your textbook and some of what I'm showing you today, what we call Greek, is actually Roman. The Romans loved the Greeks, and they copied their sculpture quite frequently. Oftentimes these exist in many different versions. So for example, the famous discus thrower, you can find that in several museums in the world, and those are they are exclusively all Roman copies of Greek originals. The Romans copied in marble after other marble statues, but they also copied in marble after bronze statues. So some of the works that I'm showing you today, you'll see a marble copy of it, but originally it would have been bronze. Bronze works very rarely survive because they are melted down to create things like weapons or coins or other sculptures even. So this is the actual work that model I was just showing you is based on. This is the Doryphorus by Polykleitos, and the word Doryphorus means spear bearer. And this sculpture is a manifestation of his ideal canon of proportions that he developed. It's a bit different than some of the later works that we'll look at, the way the body is formed. It's showing this ideal figure. There's no more of the stylization like we saw with the Koros figure. The hair looks much more real. The features resemble a human face. Bodies look like this. Of course, this is idealized, and that's very important to remember. But instead of that little step forward that we had with the foot, we now have this more naturalistic pose where the hips are matching what the feet are doing. Now I'm going to go back to that image just a second ago right here, showing these different planes in the human body. You see these different lines here. This is showing these different cross weights and the angles and lines that go through the major points of the body that are in perfect harmony and proportion to one another. So each area of the body is related to the size of the other areas of the body, and this was typically based on the size of the head overall. This is also showing a really good rendering of what is called contrapposto, and this is an Italian word meaning counter posture. So you see that one leg here is doing the work, it's holding the body's weight, and by contrast, the opposite arm, so following this diagonal line, this arm is doing the work. Here the muscles are clenched. This is the arm that's holding the spear. By contrast, you have a leg that is supporting very little weight in comparison and is bent and is moving in space. And here you have a free arm that is not in any activity. So you have this sort of X created by the motions of the body. And this is actually how people stand or how people move through space. So it's much more naturalistic. I don't really want to say the word realistic because it's hard to say that this is realistic. This isn't what you would see in the street. This is naturalistic. It is inspired by an idealized form of reality. I want to move on now to a work that was discovered in a shipwreck, actually. That's what you're seeing down below. This was found off the coast of Italy, off the city of Riace. And so this is known as Warrior A, and often is referred to as the Riace Warrior. So this is an example of an original that survives, and it survives because the ship it was traveling on sank. So much of southern Italy was actually part of the Greek colonies, so they exported a lot of sculpture, a lot of architectural types, and if you go to southern Italy, you can actually find some of the best preserved Greek temples in the world. But here we see on the bottom the body as it was coming out of the water after archaeologists discovered the shipwreck and pulled it out. There's actually two sculptures that survive. And at the upper part here, I'm showing you a detail of the face to give you a sense of just how naturalistic these things can look. Very rarely do we have these originals that survive, so this is a remarkable find that was done in the early 70s. And here we see him from both front and back. This is the same warrior. I'm only showing you one of the two. It says, breaking away from the Egyptian-influenced poses of the Kore and the Koros that I showed you a minute ago in only a few generations. This is hardly that much more forward in time, just about 100 years. This is paying attention to the way a person would actually stand by using contrapposto. So just like with the Doryphorus that I just showed you, you can see that the Riace warrior has one leg that is bearing the majority of the weight, and another one, its cross arm, which would have been holding a spear or whatever he would have been holding originally, whereas its counterpart, his other arm, is free as is this leg here. It's not straight, it's at rest. And you get that across of the body as well. Notice the shift of the hips to match the change in where the legs are, and the same in the shoulders. The shoulders correspond to exactly what the arms are doing. This contrapposto separates classical from archaic Greek statuary. What we have is a balance between naturalistic forms and this idealized body type. There's a youthfulness to the muscles that doesn't quite fit with the maturity of the face that I showed you just a moment ago. Certain details make it very lifelike, like the swelling veins of the hands and the arms, the very careful rendering of the hair, and these lifelike effects are heightened by these inset eyes made of bone and colored glass. The eyelashes, I hope you can make them out just a little bit. They're made of finely cast strands of bronze, and his teeth are silver plated. So imagine seeing this. Imagine watching the sun glint off of it. It was probably part of a monument along with its other sculpture that was found with it, probably part of a monument commemorating a military victory. And on his left arm, you can even see part of the shield that survives. So he is a warrior type. Now I want to turn to one of the most famous monuments in Western art, probably in the entire world. What I'm showing you here is the Parthenon, which sits on top of the Acropolis in Athens, Greece. It has become a standard for perfect building types, and even today, even in Philadelphia, you see copies of it. You see borrowings from it. Here we have a bank in downtown Philadelphia. This classical architecture comes to symbolize democracy and order and harmony. And the reason these things are so easy to replicate is because the Greeks followed very standardized building types. So what I'm showing you here is a diagram showing the three major Greek orders. We have the Doric on the left. This one is developed the earliest, and it is the simplest. A couple of basic vocabulary words that you should know, especially when it's talking about these basic types of architecture. We have the shaft of the column, and you see in the later orders it also develops a base, so a column base is also very important. Then on top you have an element referred to as the capital, and here we see three different kinds of capital. The capital is actually the easiest way to tell which type of architectural order we're dealing with. So the Doric order typically sat on a low stereobate, this series of steps, had a shaft that was wider at the bottom and narrow to the top. These columns are almost always made out of drums. You can see these faint horizontal lines representing the different pieces that would be slotted over a long piece of iron or bronze holding them together. And then part of these orders, it's more than just the columns, it's also what comes on top. The order of the entablature, which is this entire structure here, same as here, even though it's not indicating it. You have the part right on top of the column capital. This is consistent through all three orders, called the architrave. Then you obviously have different elements of these architraves. Then you have different elements above that. With the Doric order, you have metopes, which often held sculptures. And you also have these triglyphs, which are just ornamental decoration. And then on top of each of these, you almost always have what's called a pediment. So we're only showing you a tiny corner of this, but these are these triangular rooftops that you see with lots and lots and lots of Greek temples. You even see it in Roman temples, so this is going to come up again. With the Ionic order, you have a thinner column. The proportions are quite different than the Doric, and you have these very distinctive volute capitals. You see these swirls. These are called volutes. On top of an Ionic column, you would have your architrave, and then above that, typically a continuous frieze of sculpture, and we'll see this in just a minute as well. With the Corinthian, you have the most complicated of the three Greek orders, set on top of some stairs, a column base, and then an even thinner column with a very ornate capital. These are very complicated. They often involve volutes from the Ionic, but they emphasize acanthus leaf, so it almost looks like it's this organic plant. And now on top, these are typically much more simple. Above the column capital, you might have these dentils. So now let's talk a little bit about the Acropolis in general. Athens itself is below this, and you see this flattened hilltop that has been made that way for construction. There's a significant processional way that led up and still does lead up to the Acropolis through a monumental gateway. We see the remains of it right here. This is the focal point of the city with the most important religious structures here, and this is where most ceremonial activities would culminate. It was largely destroyed in 480 BCE by the Persians. Remember, that was the year that I said was the beginning of the classical period. The Athenians battled the Persians repeatedly. And following this destruction, a man named Pericles convinced the Athenians to rebuild. You'll read a lot about him in your supplementary reading for today. Pericles was a political leader responsible for rebuilding the Acropolis. There was a heavy opposition to the amount of money he put into the project, and this building went on from the mid to early 5th century BCE. But he was a dynamic leader and an important patron of the arts. He used art to adorn the city and to promote a public image of peace and prosperity. This can be seen as a reflection of the city of Athens' status, in terms of it being a visual expression of Athenian values and civic pride. The protection of the city by the goddess Athena was very, very important. The splendor of the materials used, mostly in ivory, gold, exotic woods, very fine marble, and the variety of building types reflect the self-confidence of Athens and its economic might. It's all about power, wealth, optimism, and democracy for the male citizens. Here's a reconstruction of what the Acropolis probably would have looked like in its heyday. There are a number of temples here. Your book talks about several, but we're going to be focusing on the largest monument here, the Parthenon. But here you have the monumental gateway, the propylaea, that the processions would enter through. Pericles was responsible for building all of this up at this point in time. Here's another reconstruction just to give you a sense of how grand it might have been and seeing it a little bit from below. It was somewhat fortified, but you can see it's still quite open and visible from the city below. Now, I'm turning here to an image from the frieze of the Parthenon. What we're seeing here is part of a procession, and this procession makes up the vast majority of the sculpture that comes from the Parthenon. Every 4 years, they would have a procession called the Panathenaic Festival, where everyone would participate, and they would bring a new garment, which is what we're seeing right here, that these two figures are folding up, this new garment called a peplos that they would take to clothe the cult statue of the goddess Athena in that. Here's a reconstruction of what the cult goddess would have looked like. She was a sculpture made out of ivory and gold. Here we have the powerful Athena in the innermost chamber. Athena is the goddess of wisdom and of war and peace. There are several manifestations of her, including the figure of victory, and we see her holding a little victory figure here. She had a massive shield, which had lots and lots of figural depictions on it, and you can see based on the proportions compared to these little figures slotted in that it was massive. We actually know quite a bit about what it looked like because several copies of it were made in coins, but also in little models that survive, so we have a pretty good sense of what it looked like. Here's a reconstruction drawing so what we can see what the Parthenon would have looked like at its most complete state. Much of the structure is missing today after it survived much war and turmoil. That area has undergone a lot of political changes, and it also included a significant explosion that occurred inside the Parthenon in the 18th century. What we see here is a manifestation of the Greek ideal of temple architecture. It's very carefully planned, with several modifications actually made for optical effects to create a seemingly perfect structure. So for example, what we see here, this is a dramatic rendering of some of these modifications, but it gives you a sense of what's actually going on with the Greeks. So we have a curved pedestal. You see how the base, these steps are curved here. You can see here that the corner columns are actually placed more closely to their neighbors than the next ones over. This is called the space of the intercolumniation. The capitals are squared in a way that otherwise wouldn't have been done. And there's actually a slight swelling to the column. This is called the entasis. And this is all so that things look straight. So from a distance, to have these modifications actually makes things appear more regular. That curving of the pedestal makes it actually look straight. The curving of the columns make them look straight. Otherwise, they would look strange. So the Greeks were very aware of the optics involved, of how to accommodate their architecture so it looked perfect. So I mentioned that there is very careful mathematic proportion used in the construction of this temple. There's a very specific ratio of 4 to 9 in the width versus the length. The proportions to the ancient Greeks are as important in architecture as they were in sculpture. Everything is cut very, very precisely. This diagram shows you all of the columns that were used. All of those circles that you see in this ground plan show the columns. The dark lines here are the actual built walls. And you can see the opening here is the doorway. Here you have where the cult statue would have been. This back part was actually used as a treasury, which your supplementary reading talks about. This diagram also shows the various sculpture, the location of the various sculptures, and the different stories that they tell. So in the innermost part, the most important part of the temple, you have procession scenes from the Panathenaic processions, and we'll look at details of that in just a few minutes. You also have on either side those metopes, remember the sculptural decoration of the Doric order, on one side showing the sack of Troy, and on the other side showing what's called a centauromache, which is the battle between the Lapiths and the centaurs. On the east side, we have metopes showing the gigantomachy, which is the battle between the gods and the giants. Above that, we have a pediment that is depicting the birth of Athena. Opposite on the west side, you have 14 metopes showing the Amazonomachy, which is the battle between the Amazons and the Greeks. And in the pediment above that, we have the contest between Athena and Poseidon to be the patron god or goddess of the city of Athens. Obviously, Athena won because it is named for her. This is a cutaway drawing to give you a sense of how the columns related to each other and how the sculpture also related to each other. So here, indicated at number 1, you have that continuous Ionic frieze, which showed the Panathenaic procession. Indicated as number 2, above the Doric order of the 2 porches on either side, you have these various metopes and the triglyphs that separate each metope. And then at number 3, you see how the pediment stood above the metopes here. The whole monument, its architecture and its sculpture, were all designed by a single artist named Phidias. He was a friend of Pericles, and he is the one who organized the large quantities of gold, ivory, exotic wood, and 22,000 tons of marble to be brought from a site 10 miles away. There are 2 architects associated with this monument who actually worked out the proportions based on Phidias's ideas. They're named Iktinos and Kallikrates, and Iktinos is known to have written a book on proportion during his lifetime as well. The sculpture attached to the monument actually contributes to the ceremonies because it shows processions that almost certainly took place. So if you were an Athenian at this time, you would process up from the lower city of Athens all the way up to the Acropolis, and you would be a part of this event that is shown taking place in the inner order of the temple. So now let's turn to some of the sculpture. I'll show you a few examples of each of the different parts. What we're seeing here is one of the metopes depicting the battle between the Lapiths and the centaurs. The Lapith is a type of man. He's just a regular man. It's just a distinction given to him based on where he's from. And he's fighting a centaur, which is a beast that is half man and half horse. So there were 92 metopes on the exterior of the temple. Most of these are found today in the British Museum, which is something that you will talk about for your discussion board today. These reliefs depict the legendary battles that I mentioned before, and they're simplified to 2 representative figures in each metope. It's a symbol of the might of Athens and their association with the gods. So when a man is fighting the beasts, the man is going to win. And this is a symbol of the Athenians, the men, overcoming their foes, the beasts. This is this perfect moment captured. Both figures are fluid. The artist has reduced the forms to only the essentials. It's this perfectly balanced X-shaped composition. And in this single moment, you can get a sense of a much larger event, especially when seen with the other metopes right around it. Now, nobody would have seen these things up close. This is something very important. Even though I'm showing you this straight on, this is not how the original viewer would have seen it. It had to be readable from a great distance below, which is one of the major reasons these are simplified so much. Even in its simplification, though, notice the naturalism and the idealization of the figures. There's a total equilibrium between the 2 figures, even though there's a grueling battle going on. It's almost like a ballet as the Lapith grabs the mane of the centaur. He's got his hands pinned behind his back, and it looks almost like the Lapith is about to stab him. So it's kind of the end for this centaur. Now I'd like to talk about the east pediment. This is the one that would have faced people as they came up the Acropolis for the Panathenaic procession. It has to be shown in reconstruction because lots of parts of it are missing. The Parthenon has had a serious history of destruction, and as I mentioned, the metapiece being in the British Museum, most of this sculpture is in the British Museum as well. They were cut out by a British lord who later sold them to the British Museum. So they have quite a history. So what we're seeing in this east pediment is the birth of Athena. She was one of the children of Zeus, but she was not born in a normal way. She sprung out of his head. So there's a narrative going on here. So here I want you to notice the couple of figures over to the bottom left here. You see this reclining figure, and notice these three horses. Right here is the base of a chariot. So in order to fill the pediment with the most sculpture possible, all of the sculpture has been modified according to its position. So we have this chariot that seems to be rising out of the space that's not depicted, and a reclining god here. And notice everybody else leading up to the standing figures right in the center. Here we have Zeus and Athena standing next to him. They all correspond to their exact position in the pediment for their size. So notice these figures here. I'm going to move on to an actual image of them. This is what you see in the British Museum. If you go there today, you can see a significant amount of loss has happened. The fact that they continue out of the frame almost makes them more lifelike, and I think seeing them in their museum context takes some of that away, unfortunately. Here we have the figure of that reclining god. I'm showing it to you from an angle that an original viewer never would have seen it. But the thing to remember is the artist took so much care that even though he knew nobody would ever see it, he's showing this significant emphasis on this musculature, this idealization of the body. Of course, the sculpture's been damaged a bit, but you can see in this detail that I'm showing you this strong emphasis on idealized, naturalistic bodies. The Greeks loved the human form. It is the most important thing to them. Now here I'm showing you a couple of images that continue that pediment. So you see a couple of seated goddesses here. And here we have part of the right side of this pediment. Now this sculptural group is probably the most famous from this pediment. We have these three seated goddesses. They have this harmonious consistency. They're these really massive figures, but they manage to be very graceful at the same time. And this position that they've been placed in because of their sighting inside the pediment with the sloping roof coming down over them, and they're informed by their placement, but they seem very naturalistic. Like this pose seems perfectly reasonable for them to be in. Notice this emphasis on their bodies under the fabric. You may remember I mentioned that it wasn't appropriate to show women nude, but what the classical sculptors like to do was use what's called wet drapery, where it looks like the clothing, drapery is the fancy art history word for clothing, it looks like it's wet, it's clinging to their skin so that you can see their bodies underneath. So it both covers and it reveals at the same time. There's an expert rendering here of the female form, and it's idealized yet naturalistic. There's absolutely no awkwardness here. Notice also that these would have been set into this pediment, so nobody ever would have seen the back. They could have actually been made as relief sculpture, so that they would have still been attached to their stone, but instead they're carved completely in the round. So let's move on to some of the scenes from the frieze. Here is a recreation of what some of the processional imagery would have looked like. All of these things were originally painted. We often think of Greek art and architecture as being this brilliant, stunning white, but it wasn't. They liked their white marble, but then they painted it to make it look lifelike. So what we're seeing here is this illusionistic procession to the Parthenon showing the Panathenaic Festival. As I said, this was this festival that occurred every 4 years when the women of the city brought a new peplos to adorn the statue of Athena. Men also took part in this, but they were not the ones in charge of the peplos. Here in this image, I'm showing you how easy it would have been if you were standing on the ground to actually see this procession of horsemen, even though it's in the inner row of sculpture. So we have lots of different processional scenes. We have horsemen, we have young walkers. These are idealized types, not portraits, but instead they're supposed to be representative types of citizens of the successful city. So here we have somebody with a horse, but notice the facial type is idealized, but you probably wouldn't see this person walking down the street. The sculptures are tilted slightly, so they were easier to be seen from below. The whole message of the frieze is to show that the Athenians are healthy and united as a city. They completely represent the citizenry of the city. You may notice that the carvings are actually tilted just a little bit so they can be seen better from below. And there's definitely different levels of carving so as to indicate an illusion of space. So there's overlapping between the horses. Some horses are carved more fully in the round to show that they are closer to you in space. Classical sculpture is characterized by purity, calmness, perfection, and control. So even though the vast majority of the horses in the scene are rearing, they're back on their legs, their riders are perfectly balanced, everything is calm. It's almost just like the sculptor is showing off how well he can show a horse. Not any tension or anxiety. It's all perfect and in control. It's meant to be this dynamism in the midst of calmness. I also like this image that I'm showing you here just to give you a sense of just how painted this would have been. It would have been dramatically different than what it looks like today. So let's move on from the Parthenon. We looked at a lot of sculpture from that, and we'll move into the late classical period here. There's quite a bit of a difference in taste in this period. So now we're mostly in the 4th century instead of the 5th. The 4th century BCE. The 4th century BCE is when the most famous Greeks that we know today were born. So Aristotle and Plato and Socrates all come from that period. The mood changed from this confident superiority to from the high classical period to a sort of disillusionment. Athens was no longer the sole political leader. Now, with sculpture, we still see an interest in the human figure, but the ideal proportions change. The figures become taller overall. Their heads are smaller in proportion. They're a little less calm or detached than what we originally saw. And there also seems to be some introspection or anxiety, which will eventually lead to the extremes we see in the Hellenic. Now what I'm showing you here is a sculpture called the Aphrodite of Cnidos by a sculptor named Praxiteles, and it dates to about 350 BCE. And this figure I'm showing you is quite a bit over life size at about 6 feet. Praxiteles is a Greek sculptor whose originals are actually done in marble instead of bronze. But most of the figures that we call done by Praxiteles are actually Roman copies. This, for example, is a Roman copy. This is the first full-scale human in the round. That means fully carved away from the block rather than as a relief that is shown nude. But it's okay because she's a goddess. So she's sort of an abstracted ideal. There's actually a narrative going on with the figure. She's preparing to bathe and has just taken off her clothing. So you might notice with a lot of these marble sculptures that you have some kind of support mechanism that's referred to as a strut. You have here this jar of water sitting on a little base and her clothing that's draped over the jar. This isn't just to be there for the narrative. This actually is holding the marble up. Marble is a weak material. It's very heavy and it's very easy to break. So you have to have these supports or otherwise the thing is going to fall apart. Before this sculpture, the only women who were shown nude were those of a low character. Nudity is not considered an ideal for a woman, but it's okay here, like I said, because she is a goddess. It was said with this sculpture that Aphrodite saw it, and she wondered when the artist could possibly have seen her naked. So they like to adapt these stories to the sculptures. We have an adapted sort of contrapposto here. Remember, we have a leg that's supporting most of the weight and a free leg, but notice the arms are not quite right to fit our typical definition of contrapposto. This is very typical of the late classical style, especially with the sort of introduction of an S curve to the body. It's not something we saw in the earlier classical period. She also has this seeming gesture of modesty where she takes her right arm and sort of covers her groin area. But in fact, it really is there to emphasize her nudity rather than to conceal. So anytime you see a goddess figure who's covering herself up, it's actually this artist's way of playing with it and actually drawing your attention to that area. This sculpture, the original of this sculpture, was placed in an open shrine so that people could view it from every side. The known copies of it numbered into the hundreds, and almost 50 of them survive today. So this was a very famous sculpture from a period when there were lots and lots of nudes. So this one was idealized. It was considered better than a lot of the other ones at the time. So I want to move on now to the final period of our study for the day, which is called the Hellenistic Period. This is also bookended by 2 events. The first event is the death of Alexander, which also ends our classical period in 323 BCE. And it's bookended on the other side almost 3 centuries later by the Battle of Actium, which was when Augustus defeated Mark Antony. It was when Egypt was conquered by the Romans, and this happened in 31 BCE. After the death of Alexander the Great, there was a bit of a decline in Greece. His generals split up the empire, portioned it up for themselves, but the Greek culture persisted in many of the regions and had significantly lasting effects. Some of the major characteristics of Hellenistic art are drama, expressionism, diagonals. The figures reach out into the space of the viewer. It deals more with everyday people rather than heroic events. There's a focus on mortals instead of gods. There's individualized emotion, and there's more dazzling surface treatments, very dramatic subjects and poses. And here we see even more an idealized naturalism. What I'm showing you here is the theater of the city of Epidaurus from the 4th century BCE with later additions as well. Remember that I said that with the Hellenistic there's a great emphasis on drama, and I mean that very literally as well. So in the Hellenistic world, also in the classical world, but in the Hellenistic period we see this rise in dramas and theaters. And so I wanted to show you just one example of a Greek theater. It was one of the most important centers of Greek culture. Lots of people would come to the theater to see and be seen. So you didn't just go to watch the show, you were sort of putting on a show yourself. They developed theaters and plays, the Greeks did. Greek tragedies are especially important. It was a place for religious expression through theater, music, and dance. These places had a certain association with the god Dionysus, who was the god of wine. Here's a line drawing of the theater of Epidaurus to show you the 3 major parts of the theater. First, on top you have the auditorium, which is the seating area for the people. Notice that word auditorium is related to how well you can hear. The lower part is the orchestra, and that encompasses both the stage and the first several rows. And then the bottom word is scena. And what that was this architectural permanent part of the theater that made up the backdrop. They could add some things and change it just a little bit, but this is where the drama took place. This is what it was set against. So here's an artistic rendering of what the scena might have looked like with a stage or proscenium. There's lots of words we can use for this. You'll often see scenophrons. What it would have looked like in Epidaurus and other theaters as well. This was not unique to Epidaurus. So this is significant architectural backdrop, very permanent. And you can see there's actually artwork on display. There's some up here on these different column bases, here at either end of the stage, right in the center of the stage. And also there was an altar to the god Dionysus right in the center of the orchestra. So remember this emphasis on Dionysus. People in plays would often address themselves to this god because he's the god of wine, but he's also the god of having a good time. In the theater, that's where you go to have a good time. And so here's an example of an altar to Dionysus. You can see these theater masks on either side. Theater also is very important to the Romans, so it's this major cultural contribution of the Greeks and development of the Romans. So the performance would take place in the orchestra area, so down in the circle where you see the visitors to Epidaurus today, but also up on the stage platform. So here's the remnants of the scena that I mentioned before. It's the foundations primarily, everything else has been taken away. Now you might notice that this is very similar to structures we see today. This is actually the model for sports arenas. You have this semicircular tier of seats so that people behind can still see as well, and actually most of these are acoustically perfect spaces. They're built into hillsides so that they don't actually have to bring in a lot of marble to build up the space. Instead, the seats are just built into on top of the hillside so that they could just save in construction materials. Then everybody can see. These create acoustically fabulous spaces and uninterrupted sight lines. These sites are chosen very carefully, built into the hillside. There are earlier theaters on hillsides that don't even have any seating built. So at Epidaurus, we have a theater of 55 rows of seats. It's 387 feet in diameter, and it could accommodate up to 12,000 people. So it's a really significant amount of people that could crowd into the space. It maybe doesn't seem that big to us, but it's actually quite large. And here it's seen from above. This might give you a better sense of just how large this space is. And here also you can see the remnants of the scena, which was always there. It was just as an important part of the theater as the seats themselves. And here's the view. If that scena franz wasn't there, you could look well over into the countryside. So these are often built in these magnificent, magnificent places. Now I'd like to talk about this monument. This is called the Altar of Zeus. It comes from the city of Pergamon in what is now modern-day Turkey, and it dates from about 175 to 150 BCE. So we've moved forward considerably in time. Today, if you want to see the Pergamon altar, you actually have to go to Berlin. So a lot of times archaeologists, especially from Germany and from England, they would go to these ancient sites and they would just pick everything up and cart them back to their home countries. So if you go to Pergamon today, you see the foundations of this, but nothing else. This was this major monument in the city, and the archaeologists just picked it up and hauled it off. The original altar was a one-story structure raised on a high platform, which has been recreated in this museum. It has an Ionic colonnade, so you can see hopefully here the column capitals have those Ionic volutes. And we have a monumental staircase here surrounded by a continuous sculptural frieze. Now in this scene you can also see sculpture along the walls. You have to actually imagine that ran around the back side of the altar, but in the museum it's been sort of inverted. That way you can see it. They didn't have a room big enough to reconstruct the entire altar. So here we just have the wings and the staircase of this front part. In this frieze, we have the battle between the Greek gods and the giants. The frieze is more than 7 feet high, and the sculpture is in such high relief that many of the figures actually come out into the space of the viewer. Like we see these figures here. They're falling onto the steps. They come interact with you as you're approaching this temple. It's a continuous scene that has arbitrary borders, so these figures are as big and sometimes even bigger than you are. So remember what I said about in the Hellenistic, you've got this drama and this incorporation of the viewer in a lot of ways. The gods are human and they fight the giants, who are mostly human looking, but they're hybrid creatures that have these snake-like legs. You can see a few of them here. I want to show you one detail in particular. This is probably the most famous scene, and it's called Athena battling the giants. So we have Athena standing here in the very center. Unfortunately, we're missing her face. She grabs the hair of a male monster right here and forces him down to his knees. And there's an inscription that actually identifies the figure for us, so we can name these people and giants. On the lower right side, we have the mother of this giant rising out of the ground to plead with the goddess for her son's life. You can see her reaching up and grabbing on to the garments of Athena. And above the figure of the mother, you see a victory figure, a Nike, which remember is another manifestation of Athena. She's rushing in to crown Athena with a victory wreath. And this is something else that we've lost, unfortunately. You have rippling muscles on the figure. You have overly emotional faces and this very dramatic diagonal composition. There's a significant difference in the drapery in the Hellenistic period than what we saw with the classical period. It's much heavier and seems to move a bit more on its own. It blows in the breeze. It shows her body underneath, but not the same way we saw with the wet drapery of the classical period. Just as with the figures on the stairs, this is not a scene on the stairs. They jut into the space of the viewer. Look how fully carved they are. They really come out from the stone that they're attached to. It shows a high skill of the artist. These deep carvings of the eyes and of the hair create lots of shadows. It's a very theatrical and complex interaction between the figures and the viewers who are seeing these. There's a balance achieved through opposition, through fighting, through diagonals, and this is a benchmark of Hellenistic art. No more calmness, like remember with the horses in the procession, even though they're rearing up, they're still very calm. There's no more smooth surfaces or stability as in the classical period. Here it's all about extreme expressions and expressions of emotion. So you can really get a sense of how these giants are feeling being defeated. Nobody's going to beat Athena, so they were destined to lose from the very beginning. The final monument I want to show you for this lecture is this sculpture called the Layoutgoon and his sons. And here we also know the names of the artists. This is by Hagisandros, Polydoros, and Athenodorus from the island of Rhodes. This dates to the 1st century CE and is about 8 feet high and made out of marble. This is a very famous sculpture that was actually described in the writings of Pliny the Elder, a famous Roman writer. There is some trouble dating this work. I said it's from the 1st century CE, but there's some disagreement between art historians. It might be the original, which we know was done in marble, but it might also be a copy. It may have been brought over from Greece. It may be a Roman copy, but the sculpting is very sophisticated, so it's hard to know the difference here. It was actually discovered in Rome in a hill just above the Colosseum in the early 1500s. And when Pope Julius II found out about it, we'll talk about him more later in the semester, he sent his architect named Giuliano da Sangallo to go see it as it was excavated from the ground. And Sangallo took his good friend, the sculptor Michelangelo. So Michelangelo was there when this thing came out of the ground. It's a very complex composition, and it's a story from the Trojan War. Layoutgoon was a priest who warned the Trojans not to take the big wooden horse that the Greeks ended up defeating the Trojans with. So if you're not familiar with that story, I'll recap it very briefly. After 10 years of fighting, Odysseus had this great idea for how to beat the Trojans. And he said, let's build a wooden horse. We'll hide inside, we'll pretend to sail away, and then the Trojans will let us into the city, and then we can all come out of it at night and kill them all. And that's exactly what happened. But Layoutgoon, when the Trojans saw the horse, he said, well, maybe we shouldn't just jump to conclusions and take the horse into the city. It might not be the best idea. But what happened is Athena was on the side of the Greeks. She sent 2 serpents out of the water to attack Layoutgoon and to silence him so that the Trojans would, in fact, take that horse into their city. Again, as with the Athena battling the giants we just saw, we have this diagonal composition reaching into the viewer's space. It's very expressionistic, and it commands this empathetic response. Here's another view of it to get a sense of this idealized naturalism of the musculature, and to give you a sense of the deep carving of the head, especially of Layoutgoon, this very large dominant figure. Here's another view from the side. You see how small these suns are. It's an interesting strategy on the part of the artist. The suns weren't that much younger. They weren't young boys, I mean. They instead are just smaller because Layoutgoon is the most important figure here. Here we see one sun getting away from the snakes. One sun managed to survive, and we see him here. You have these very intricate positions and movements. Here we see the snake biting the sun who does not survive. And again, this is a great example of part of it commanding this empathetic response from the viewer. It was conceived to be seen from the front, which maybe some of these side views have shown you that. But it's very typical of Hellenistic art in the diagonals, in the extreme emotion, and the strong idealization that's going on, even in the midst of this dramatic story. Just to give you a recap of the day, we've talked about 3 major artistic styles here, the Archaic, the Classical, and the Hellenistic. Remember, it's a strange political situation in ancient Greece, but architecture, especially with the Acropolis in Athens under Pericles, is a way of manifesting the confidence of the Athenians in a strange political situation. We've talked a lot about humanism, this human-centered society where man is the measure of all things, and also this strong interest in naturalism of the Greeks. We've moved away from the permanence and fixed nature of the Egyptians to this very dynamic and quickly changing styles of the Greeks, and the strong interest in an idealized form of naturalism. So now what you need to do to finish Module 3 is to take the self-assessment. Do that immediately after watching this video. Also, for the discussion board, I have a YouTube video for you to watch about the situation with the Parthenon marbles. I'm interested to hear your take on this subject. Also, you have a journal entry to do where you will do some comparison of Egyptian and Greek sculptural types. And finally, review the vocabulary wiki for the week. Again, this is something I'm doing for this week. You will begin doing that next week. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next time for Module 4, where we talk about ancient Rome. Thank you.